Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 7th annual CSDS Sustainability Crash Course event, which of course kicks off Green Week here at Pratt. Thank you for coming. Today we have a presentation from Aaris that will run till 2:20. Feel free to stick around. We also have a reception at CSDS downstairs at the end of the day, which you're all welcome to join us at. So I will now hand it over to Aaris.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm thrilled to be part of Sustainability Crash Course at Pratt this year. I've been told to stay relatively close to the computer for the live stream. So I'm keeping a hand here in hopes that I'll actually follow those directions because I have a tendency to wander. But today, what I'm going to be talking about today is the evolution in my thinking over about a decade around topics of sustainability. And I'm going to be using two different book projects as a framework for talking about sort of that change in thinking and where I started out and sort of where I've ended up today. So first of all, I was told, and this may or may not be true, I was told that for some people this may be their sort of introduction to sustainability, and some people are already, working in the area. So I thought it would be useful to think about the term sustainability as opposed to green or eco, just as a starting point, and to think about why those of us working in sustainability have a tendency to really preface sustainability over green or eco. So I like to talk about that by first starting out with the idea of, if we could just imagine sort of environmentalism, what do you think would be best for like plants and animals? Think about the environment. Any idea what would be best, like if we had to just preface the environment? Best case scenario. So one I always challenge my students on like the first day of class, so you're getting that experience. Like what changes would be best? Like what would be the best possible case for the environment? Humidity's good. Unless you don't like humidity and you're like a desert animal, right? What else? Like bigger picture.
No changes?
No changes? Well, what about us? Are we doing good things?
No lack of humans.
Right. So eventually, after a while, usually more than we have time for here, we get to the fact that if we just are prefacing the environment, we end up at the fact that probably a world without humans would really be the best thing for the environment, except if you're a domesticated species like dogs who seem to sort of rule us as opposed to the other way around, right? So obviously we're all here today in this room and we're hoping to stick around, and many of us are hoping to have children and grandchildren who are able to stick around and live long and healthy lives on the planet. And so to me, that's sort of the problem with simple environmentalism, is that without taking into account people, and then as soon as you sort of start thinking about people, you get the economic situation as well, you end up with kind of a narrow view of what a solution would be and a narrow view of even how to scope out the problem. So sustainability really prefaces this balance of environmental, economic, and social, and in the middle is that sweet spot. So, if you are ever asked, like, why not just green? I mean, I like to take it to that end view of like, here's where we would go if we were just being green. So, as I said, I'm going to be talking about sustainability and sort of my thinking in evolution, and that really started out with a book that was published not quite 10 years ago. And that's A Handbook of Materials and Applications for Graphic Designers and their Clients. And from that very long subtitle that the publisher wanted included for searchability purposes on Amazon, you'll see that sort of locates me right there in the world of graphic design, right? So I'm trained as an MFA in graphic design. So that was sort of the standpoint that I came at the problem with. And I started with this notion that design has a materials problem. And that's certainly true of graphic or communication design, but we know it's not just communication design, it's product design, it's fashion design. Any of us who produce stuff, right? As long as we're not producing other, screen-based things or sort of strategy-based work, we're producing stuff, we have a materials problem. In communication design, about 70 to 75% of what we produce ends up within the trash within about a year. And as a product designer, for instance, that duration might be slightly longer. But I don't know if any of you have been in dorms or have seen dorms, but you start out in September, very exuberant with all of this new IKEA furniture. And then by May and June, when everybody's immediately got to move out of the dorm, where does a lot of that dorm furniture end up? It either ends up on the curb, hopefully, so at least somebody else, in New York will take it with them, but or it ends up in a dumpster, right? So we get to work with an object for a certain amount of time as a consumer, and then we still have the materials problem of where it ends up. So I started out really being interested in production areas for graphic or communication design. And that was the paper production, that was basically print design. And so we started out with paper production target areas. So that's Forest Stewardship Council, that's what the FSC stands for, or recycled pulp for production. That's, the trees should be sustainably managed. Elemental or totally free chlorine for the bleaching. That's why your paper in front of you is white and not sort of a brownish color. Sourcing of renewable energy. Paper production is actually an incredibly intense, resource-intensive, energy-intensive process. Imagine getting a tree that's sitting outside into a sheet of paper. It takes a lot of energy to do that. Air and water safe production, and safe and equitable working conditions for employees. So then that's just to create the sheet of paper. But then when we talk about print production, we start to think about the design and then getting it onto the paper. And so that's what happens on press. And so then we're thinking about specifying FSC or recycled paper stock that has the attributes that I showed you in the last slide. Low VOC, VOC is volatile organic compounds, so low VOC press washes and inks, again, sourcing of renewable energy and safe and equitable working conditions. Finally, post-production, we want to specify water-based glues and varnishes, safe disposal of inks and chemicals, and finally, disposal and recycling of trash and other paper that happens in print production. So that's where I started out in terms of framing the material problem for graphic designers, for communication designers who are working in print. But then, as I went out and started doing research and looking at examples of what that actually looked like in practice, I came right up against something that, of course, as designers, we all know, and that is that design is inventive. And so there's a few examples from that book just quickly that I want to share with you to give you a sense of the different ways that designers approach the materials problem, some that have a lot to do with what I said and some that are quite different. So this example is Noah Scallon working in Richmond, Virginia. And if we think about designers, we often keep those design decisions very close to us, like we feel very strongly about them. And so Noah's been able to give up on some projects, to give up a little bit of that control. So one of the things that he does is he works with his printer and he says, what's going to be on press around the time that I need to send my designs to print? And then if he can find a job that has decent enough colors, he actually will use the colors in his design of what was going to be on press previously, so that they don't have to wash down and use all of those solutions to clean the presses. Okay, now not all of us can imagine giving up that control over, say, our color choices, but it's an interesting approach to materiality and to sort of like giving up a little bit of control in order to mitigate some of the issues around print production. This example is quite different, but it deals with materialities issues, but not necessarily from the print production standpoint. This is a bulk buying system for an Italian grocery store. And the design company is Metalli Lindbergh in Treviso, Italy. And so the design company Metalli Lindbergh was challenged by their client to try and message out to consumers the benefits of bulk buying and to create a system that was easier, right? I mean, if you've gone to the co-op and had to fill up just a regular bag, you know that it can be unwieldy. Sometimes the oats go all over the place. You're looking at that twist tie. You're like writing the little PLU number on it, right? And so here they've created a bulk system that just takes out some of the unease of bulk systems. And then one of the benefits of bulk is that it reduces the waste of overall containers, but it's also easier for companies to ship a large quantity of the product. And so in this case, the grocery store, in order to incentivize bulk buying, has actually reduced the price of the bulk items for consumers. And so part of what Natalia Lindberg had to do was not just design the system, but message out, like, why is this better? Why are you saving money? You know, and then get you to remember to bring that container back to the store, right? Which is always the tough part. But then we run into the issue of what happens when print production is just not available in a particular area. And this is the thing. Like, I have an MFA in design, but I'm largely a researcher and writer about design now. And this is one of the things that I love about researching, is that you find out things that you didn't know, which we all know about research, but you just are able to dig into what's happening in different places in the world and talk to all sorts of different folks. So this is Sebastian Guarini, an Argentinian designer who's actually now working in Spain. But he was working in Argentina at a time when, as a graphic designer, communication designer, print production had a lot of challenges in terms of becoming more sustainable simply because of cost. The preferable paper stocks were just prohibitively expensive, too expensive for most of his clients. There was very little in terms of a better sort of environmental performance among printers. And so as somebody who considered himself a sustainable designer, how does he keep working in this space? And that's something that always interests me. How do people work, you know, when they're faced with adversity? And so in this case, what he does is he starts looking for clients where he can use his design skills in terms of conveying information to make a difference in another industry. So here he's actually creating pieces targeted at the construction industry. So if you think we have a materials problem, the construction industry has an enormous materials problem. If you think about taking down buildings or putting up buildings, there's a lot of material that ends up in landfills that most of us don't even think about. So what he's doing here is he's created these great little vignettes out of trash, and then he's connected that to things that people in the construction industry can do to improve the environmental performance, reduce waste, think about materials in another way. So that's not about him necessarily using better materials in production, but he's still thinking about the materials problem. So after that book came out, some of you in the audience are old enough to remember when Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out, and some of you were probably busy doing other things like playing with toys or something, and don't remember when that movie came out. But when that movie came out, there was sort of a sea change in terms of interest in sustainability in this country, in terms of the way people were talking about things. And so this first book I did came out just around that time, and honestly, that was just luck, right? But what that meant was that I was able to travel a lot and talk to designers working in a lot of different areas, product design, material engineers, fashion designers, etc. And so I began to be really influenced by those conversations. And of course, you know, ended up thinking about design as being interdisciplinary, which is something we all know. But when we're thinking about design, that idea of how interdisciplinary it is, and yet we're sort of connected by the idea of solving problems, you know, that kind of kept working its way around in my head. And I started to think about how much is happening in different industries, and at least at the time, how little cross-pollination there was in terms of ideas. So, I mean, I think this is one of the great things about the sustainability crash course, is it's not sustainability for graphic designers, it's not sustainability for product designers, it's not sustainability for fashion designers. It's just design with a big D, right? It's just sustainability, whatever that may be, and whatever discipline you might be working in. And I think that that's awesome, because we have a lot to learn from each other, right? So something that is being done by a group of product designers might be really amazing to sort of impact something you're doing as a fashion designer, or something a fashion designer is doing might give a communication designer a whole new way of thinking about conveying information around a topic. And so I started to really be interested in this idea of commonality. Like, what do we have in common in terms of problem solving and sustainability, and what do we have that are different? And I wanted to spend more time exploring that area. So if we think about, you know, this sort of evolution in my own thinking, I started out on this really sort of practical nuts and bolts materials, like what do we do about all this stuff in materials thing, and researching that. And as I started to be interested in this, in sort of the bigger picture, in this thinking about sustainability in another way. And for those of you who are students in the audience, part of the reason that I wanted to sort of talk about it this way is that I think it's important to acknowledge that as we work in an area, it's not just sort of staying with our blinders on about something, but if we're really engaged with a topic, if we're researchers, then our thinking changes as we get more and more input, right? And so for your students, for those of you who are students, the ideas that you have today are not going to be stationary. They continue to grow, and we don't even know where they're going to be in 10 years, and I think that that's one of the things that's really exciting. So in terms of me, that led to this next project, which was Sustainable Thinking, Ethical Approaches to Design and Design Management. And so again, we have a long subtitle, which helps on Amazon searches. And so immediately by that, we sort of understand that the positioning of this project is sort of more general, and there's a little bit of management as well. So in the book, as well as just talking about sustainability, I talk about how ideas for management can be applied to sustainability, and also sort of this idea of design thinking and how that impacts sustainability. So we don't have time, of course, to go through a couple hundred pages of what that is. So I wanted to just pick something that would be kind of approachable for us all to talk about here today. So I'm just going to talk about one point that has to do with that idea of commonality. What do we have in common, and what do we have that is different? So here we have touch points for sustainable design that I identified after having talked to scores of different designers working in different areas and hearing what they were working on, what their challenges were, and areas that they were really trying to affect change. And for those of you in the room who are sort of more seasoned with sustainability, you know, you might have some that you think I forgot, or some that don't belong, and that's great. That's why there's different perspectives. But these are the ones that I was sort of most interested in investigating for the purposes of this project. So the first: consumption, fair trade, efficiency, reuse, recycling, materials, technology, production, collaboration, storytelling, problem solving, entrepreneurship, innovation, strategy, and new markets. And some of those seem really obvious, like reuse and recycling or materials. And then some of those may not seem as immediately obvious, but really came up again and again when I was talking to designers, frequently enough that I felt like they deserved inclusion here. So in order to frame this part of the presentation, I again want to be looking, I'm going to be looking at case studies and showing you some examples. I always find that designers are visual people. They like to see, instead of hearing just a bunch of theory, they like to see how it might happen in practice. So this is Singhai Kartono, an Indonesian product designer. Anybody know his work? Have you ever seen his work? No. So he makes these beautiful wooden radios, and his the areas that he's working in are fair trade, efficiency, problem solving, materials, storytelling, production, and new markets. And so he has a challenge that that many people may face. How many people here are not from New York originally? Yeah, so that probably mirrors about all of New York, right? That more of us are not originally from New York than are anybody from a really small town? Anybody from a small town? A few of you from a small town, yeah. So like me, I'm from a small town. I'm actually from a town of under 1,000 people, like 800 people. So really, really small. You know, probably there's 800 people in this building right now, right? That's the whole town. And so similarly, Singhai Kartono, he went away to university, experience many of us have, learned product design, but he wanted to go home, unlike somebody like me who decided to just stay in New York. He wanted to go home and work in that small village. And like others of you who may come from either small towns or even mid-sized cities, There just what you couldn't go home and say like, okay, I'm going to like apply for that product design job, right? That didn't exist, right? The whole category of product designer didn't exist where he came from. And so in order to have a livelihood and do what he loved, he had to be an entrepreneur and an innovator. And so he created this company, Magno, which produces these wooden radios and sells them for the export market, meaning he's making them in Indonesia in this very small town or village, you know, and then he's selling them in Europe, the US, and Japan. And so what that allows him to do is sort of the $80 to $150 price tag, he's able to take that money and have an enormous impact back in his local community. So all of the radios are produced using wood that would have otherwise been burned for charcoal. Charcoal in many parts of the world is used for cooking fires. So you cook over charcoal. So the wood that we saw there would have otherwise been used for charcoal. And so there's under $1 worth of wood in each of the radios. And then he's created this factory where local people learn job skills and are paid a living wage to make the radios. So when you talk to Kartono, he's really not able to sort of separate himself as a designer from himself as a social entrepreneur and as sort of an activist, as an environmental activist. He sees those as all being just completely seamlessly connected. And here we see his small factory up at the top right. And then his village is in a place that has been an area where there's been a lot of large-scale logging for many, many years. And so part of what he does and the people who he employs and trains do is they go out and talk to the villagers about the benefits of forests and intact habitat. And then they sponsor tree planting programs. So people are able to actually, free of charge, are able to get seedlings and start to replant some of these areas that have been affected by deforestation. And so if we think about an example like this, I don't know if anybody's from Indonesia here, but at least we're not immediately living in this kind of a situation. And yet I'm always interested if there's if we find adversity everywhere, how does somebody in one situation think about solving problems, and how can we take pieces of that and apply it to another situation? So the next example is a design company in Philadelphia, and really different kind of setting. And they're called Mio. Anybody heard of Mio? No? Okay, so their touch points are collaboration, entrepreneurship, problem solving, materials, reuse, recycling, new markets, and production. And this is a cardboard room divider. So all of these pieces come separate and flat, and you put it together sort of like you did Tinker Toys as a kid, and it creates a room divider, which if we think about the idea of space and then maybe being able to take it all apart and reuse it and keep it in the closet for next time, I think is a kind of fun idea. But the reason I chose this example is, A, because we have a lot of young people in the room, and so for those of you who are college students and thinking about like, what do I do after school? How do I sort of continue some of my passion for sustainability or social activism after school, and what does that look like? This is an example of two brothers, Jaime and Isaac Salm, and they created this company. One of them was a product designer, and one of them went to business school, right? So their collaboration was in the family. So imagine if you had a sibling who went and got a finance degree or something, and you could team up with them. So one of them's the numbers guy, and one of them's the creative guy, and they've been at it for over a decade now. It's kind of a heartwarming story of a couple of people who are just out of college having an idea, starting something, and then really growing it into a larger business that has its own line of products. But the other thing that they do is they do a lot of consulting. So for instance, they'll consult on a product line for Target or something, which may not be branded by them, but they're still able to sort of expand the impact they have by reaching out and working in a variety of different areas. So what you're seeing here, these are acoustic tiles made out of recycled paperboard. And unlike acoustic tiles or tiles like we see, if you look up, you'll see a different version of an acoustic tile, one that is not decorative and is not particularly appealing visually. This takes the idea of like the acoustic tile and says, okay, how can we make this more fun? How can this work in a space and actually make it visually interesting as well as just having the acoustic properties? These examples are for office organizers. They can also hang on the wall, and they're made out of recycled felt. So it's material that has been recycled into felt. And then because it's natural material, it's actually compostable. Obviously, I wouldn't put this in my compost because it would probably take quite a while to degrade. But as opposed to something plastic in the landfill, which will be there, you know, for generations, it will eventually degrade. Pendant light. That's sort of out of context there, but the pendant light also out of recycled felt and formaldehyde-free storage container, particle board storage containers here. My personal favorite is this one here. What does that look like? Anyone? What?
Corrugated.
It looks corrugated, but can you think of like any visual reference there? Does it kind of look like origami? So actually they call this the origami table. It's made out of laser cut sheet metal. And if you see the pattern here, you can gang a whole bunch of them up next to each other, and there's very little waste when they're cut out. And then these two pieces are actually shipped together flat, so you just get like a big envelope in the mail, right? And then you have a little directions, and you actually can fold along all the seams, and at the end, instead of like a little origami thing, you have a side table. So it's called the origami side table. So anybody think of another big example of like DIY having to put it together yourself furniture? Right. So, I mean, I think when I think about IKEA, and maybe this is just because I'm not super good at putting things together, but when I think about IKEA, I usually think about like the dread, like after I bought the thing, I'm like, oh, I look great in the showroom. And then I get these like big boxes, and I bring them home, and I like spend, 3 days dreading having to put it together. I put it together, and there's all those extra screws that you can't figure out where they came from, right? And so I think that obviously, I still do buy things at IKEA, but I definitely have a frustration. I think there's like a whole industry of people who will come to your house and put together your IKEA furniture for you. But this is, in terms of this example, they're really thinking about involving the consumer in actually producing the thing that they use. And part of the philosophy behind that is that if you have joy in creating something yourself, you're maybe more likely to keep it, right? I mean, if you think about that drawing you did when you were 5 that your mom still has, right? The joy that brought her made her keep that around, and you'll probably find it when she moves out of the last house. That will always be part of something she has. Yeah, and obviously this is maybe not to that degree, but the idea is that if you have this experience of joy of having actually put something together and it wasn't frustrating, that you'll keep it around for longer. One of the ways of sort of mitigating the materials problem, it's not just about using better materials, it's also about creating situations where people don't want to just dispose of them. Right, we have that sort of very disposable culture where, oh, I just saw this new thing, I don't need that old one anymore. And so if you can get people to love the items that they have more, you solve some of the materiality problem that way. So those were sort of product design examples. I kind of come back to that idea or some of the thinking that I had around the example of Sebastian Guarini in Argentina, with this idea that design conveys information. And the design can be useful even when you're not tackling the materials problem directly. So this work is communication design work done by Bob Wilkinson in Nigeria. He's a UK-based designer who just married an American woman and moved to New York this year. If you want to look him up, he's living here now. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. But for the past 7 or so years, he spent his time working in Nigeria, creating communication, graphic design work for development agencies there. And so his touch points are collaboration, storytelling, problem-solving strategies, and new markets. And you'll see that that whole recycling, materials, production part isn't included because in Nigeria, similar to the experience in Argentina, there just wasn't a place to source environmentally preferable papers. And the printers, you were just doing well if you got the thing printed. You weren't able to, source some of those environmentally friendly print production processes either. He's also working for a company called an organization called VSO, that's Voluntary Services Organization. I'll talk more about them in a second, but they're a pretty interesting organization. So, as we know, one of the main things that we do as graphic designers is that we convey information to audiences, and sort of we're able to bring that information alive. And so these examples are of community-based school management, or community management school initiatives. So it's involving the community in managing local schools. And he's creating these communication pieces, not just in English, which is Nigeria's primary language, it's the national language, but outside of main cities, there's in many cases, people don't speak English, they speak a whole slew of local languages. So Bob is creating all of these communication pieces, and through the organization DFID, which is a development organization funded by the British government, in the languages so that people can engage with that information locally. He's also messaging out around the work that's being done by development agencies, right? So it's not, so he's amplifying their message or amplifying the work that they do by creating messaging around that. So he's sort of helping them tell that story, which, so I'd say probably storytelling is the biggest component of his work. And these are probably my favorite pieces from this series. And here he's working for VSO. This is how he got started in Nigeria. VSO is a volunteer services organization, is what the acronym stands for. They're a British-based organization similar to our Peace Corps. I would say the biggest difference with VSO is that, unlike with the Peace Corps, where you sometimes hear about people with PhDs going and sort of building houses with like mud bricks, and there's nothing wrong with that, VSO is very much about taking whatever skills you have as a volunteer and pairing that with a local organization in one of the countries they're doing development work in. So, for instance, if you were an accountant, I'm assuming there's probably no accountants in this room, but if you were an accountant, you would go and be put in, you would be partnered with an organization, maybe in Senegal, that needed some help with their books and to get their accounting in order. In this case, Bob is a designer. He's being placed in organizations in Nigeria that need help messaging out, and that's what he's doing. And I think that I just give that example for those of you who might be interested in doing something like that out of college. As I actually, when I was in Nigeria and I met with him, there were product designers who were working doing even some product design, like helping local producers make products that would appeal to an export market. And so I think that organization definitely is one that deserves support. But I love these pieces. Volunteers are not paid, not because they're worthless, but because they're priceless. And no person was ever honored for what he received. Honor has been the reward for what he gave. And I think that that's something important to keep in mind, particularly here in New York, in a place that is very money-driven, right, and status-driven. The value isn't always just quantifiable in terms of numbers. Value isn't just about money. And so giving is also something that should have value in our culture. So design is collaborative, something we all know. And this example I have in here specifically for the folks of you who are still in school. And what I find is that people get really engaged with sustainability and social activism in school, and then they're about to graduate, and you're about to graduate, what's probably the thing that your parents and your family, what's the first thing they're going to ask you? Right. They're going to be like, do you have a job? Are you getting a job? Your cousin Vinny, he already has a job, right? So, sometimes particularly for design students, those first few jobs, you're not always able to align your values with exactly what the company is producing. And that can be really hard for students making the transition from being in school to sort of being an emerging professional designer. So I think this is a really nice example. They're Element 21, they're based in Geneva. Their touch points are collaboration, storytelling, problem solving, materials, reuse, recycling, innovation, and new markets. And so instead of being a company, they're a collective, which is a particularly Germanic Swiss term. But what that means is a whole bunch of people who get together on their off time, right? Where they have day jobs. And so sometimes they just have social occasions where they're promoting the value of energy or some kind of recycling. Other times they're working really closely in their communities and coming up with ideas for changing something that they see as a problem, which may or may not actually happen. So this is one of my favorite examples. It's called Canny Plus. And in Geneva, there are 35,000 registered dogs. Now, of course, in Switzerland, everybody registers their dog. Can you imagine if we all had to register our dogs in New York? Half of us, 7/8 of us would be like, I'm not registering my dog, right? But in Geneva, everybody's actually registered their dog. So there's 35,000 registered dogs as pets, and that's more dogs than other similarly sized cities in areas in Switzerland. And so what do we know about dogs in cities? Right? Where there is a dog making some poo. And so, we've all had that experience of either having to pick up the dog waste and or wishing somebody else had picked up the dog waste, etc. So Element 21, currently dog owners in Geneva put the dog waste in city-provided bags and put them in municipal trash cans. Element 21 is proposing with this project that instead of the waste being incinerated and costing the city something to incinerate, which is the current situation, that it be composted and turned into biogas, thereby creating a revenue stream out of something that had previously cost the municipality something. Really fun idea, right? And then while they mostly work locally, remember these are all people who have day jobs, designers share their ideas and they tend to be really generous. And so this is an example of a hat that they designed, and they've made the pattern available free of charge on the internet. All you need is a small piece of cloth for the inside of the hat, scissors, a needle, thread, and a sewing machine. And then anybody know, can you tell what this might be made of here? We used what? The rice bags, right? Rice and grain bags that you certainly see, like you see these big rice bags. And so they've designed sort of a Western-centric version of a little cap, hoping that, and making it available free of charge in terms of the pattern so that people can reuse it, make little caps, reuse the material, make the little caps, and then sell to tourists. I don't know how many of you have ever gone and traveled somewhere, bought a piece of clothing or something, thought it was super cool, and you get home and it just doesn't fit with anything else that you had, even though you thought it was super cool then. So this is sort of like trying to bridge that gap with producers or maybe in developing countries with sort of patterns and designs that appeal to consumers in industrialized countries. So here we are back at my touch points. Now, everybody who has a smartphone, which I assume will mean the entire group, get out your smartphone and take a picture of that. We're going to do a little exercise. There's kind of a cheat if you don't have a smartphone, so if it doesn't work out, that's okay. And now, everybody take their, I still see all those cameras. This is the one time where you're actually told to take out your phone and start using your phone during a lecture, right? Okay, so now I'm going to give you an example where I haven't put the touch points up there, and it's a really easy example. You don't need to know anything more about the company, which is why I chose this one. So this is 100% recycled office. It's in Durban, South Africa. It's the office, it's called Mr. Walker Design. by Garth Walker, and we're not going to talk about his work. We're just going to talk about his office space. So everything in his office space has been recycled. Those are recycled milk, the things that milk and juices come in. He's got some recycled funky patterned linoleum, an old exercise bike in his hallway. His office is lit by weed whackers that have been retooled and have light bulbs in them now and are lights. If you see up on the left, the walls in the office are all just doors that were discarded, and they painted and they put hinges on it so they make a barrier. He's got all mismatched chairs and computers that for one reason or another people were not interested in owning anymore, and sort of souped them up. So that's the office. Remember, these are the touch points. You can look at your phone as well. We'll do a refresher. That's where we started. What do you think the touch points for this might be? Reuse, right? That's an easy one. Yep. What else? Technology, sure, right? I mean, there's some technology here, sure. Yeah. What else?
Storytelling.
Storytelling. What else?
Problem solving.
Problem solving. That's a big one, right? He's in this place where, and he's thinking like, how can I mean, I'm sure if you're a young person, you're thinking about like being an entrepreneur and starting your own office, like that startup cost is it can be prohibitive. So he's just like problem solving through that. Anything else? Consumption, materials, yeah. Innovation. Yeah, so you can start to see, like this, the idea of this example is that there's not really right or wrong answers. The idea is to use the touch points as a framework to start to sort of think about different designers and how they're working in the space around sustainability, and how some people are doing more of one thing and some people are doing more of another thing. But to me, that doesn't really matter. To me, it's more about analyzing and saying, hey, is there something that like I can take from what Garth Walker is doing and apply it to my own practice? Is there something I can take about like Hartono and those wooden radios, and is there something I can apply that to my own practice? So that's sort of the idea behind the touch points. Does that make a little more sense now? Yeah, great. So I'm going to end the presentation here with a quote from somebody who faced probably more adversity than we can ever imagine facing ourselves. So for all of you who are excited about sustainability and about activism, I would just challenge you as something that I challenge myself, that you, all of us, we must be the change that we wish to see in the world. Thank you. Yeah,
Do you want to take questions?
yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
That's what I thought. So I left some time at the end for questions. If you have any, if not, then I get to go and have a coffee. Any questions? You're a quiet group.
Look at everything.
Yeah?
How do you find, like, what's your process for finding all of these case studies and examples?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, right, I mean, there's always the baseline of like, let me just ask Google, right? Google must know everything. It turns out Google mostly knows what other people have been asking, right? So Google's great for like answering a question that 100,000 other people asked and giving you the right answer. But if you're trying to do something a little more nuanced, it can be difficult. I mean, one of the things I do is every person like this that I meet or talk to, I ask them to recommend. So you sort of start, it's sort of like a chain mail, like, you know, who are the 10 people you would say I should look at? And then I kind of look at them, and then, you know, I keep doing that, and that's one of the ways I do it. Yeah. Other questions? Sure. Yeah.
I guess as a design manager, is that you find sustainable thinking overlap with design?
So one of the things that I've seen in the past decade, you know, if we think about design thinking as this sort of move into companies and businesses understanding the value of design, which is just one part of it, but I think it's an important part as we all look into the future of how design sort of lives in the world, right? Another way as that happened with design thinking, you see that sort of acceptance of, and maybe more than acceptance of, sustainability as a factor to be considered as part of a business in the last sort of 7 to 10 years. Like, if you're just coming at it now, it probably seems like there's a ton of work to be done, but there's chief sustainability officers now, right? You can invest in a portfolio around socially and environmentally conscious companies, and they've actually proven to have greater returns than just sort of your vanilla regular investment. So I think that in a similar way as design thinking has meant that design is sort of gets a seat at the table, sustainability is sort of starting to have a seat at that table, and businesses are starting to recognize it's not just about avoiding regulation, which was sort of the way a lot of people started on sustainability, but that aligning with consumers' values can actually help drive profits. A question?
I'm actually curious about the portfolio aspect of
Oh, the portfolio aspect?
Yeah, the investing.
So there are these funds, can't remember exactly what their names are, but they're literally, it's sort of like you get a mutual fund, right? You get a mutual fund, but if you ask Google and you type in sort of environmentally or socially responsible funds, there are essentially groups of companies to invest in the fund managers have put together that are specifically value-based. And so, I mean, they haven't been around for 50 years, so we don't have that sort of long-term performance record, but so far they're performing as well as the other indices.
So that means that these companies are, I guess,
It means that somebody has
shareholders and
big enough to have shareholders, and somebody's vetted them to sort of say around a set of criteria which are published. So that's important, right? Because anyone can say, hey, I'm sustainable. Why don't you invest in me, right? So the fund manager, they've had to put together material to show something about their social, environmental, performance, sustainability, and then a fund manager is evaluating that. Impact investment. Thank you. Very good. Well, any other questions? No? It's a little warm in here, right? Is it always this warm in here? Wow, I would have come in a t-shirt. Okay, well, let's call it, let's stop there. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to stay after and talk to anybody. And you're always feel free to email me. I teach at St. John's University, which is just up in Queens, so I'm in the neighborhood. Thanks. What's the course I teach? I teach graphic design. Yeah, I mean, I teach a wide array of studio classes within graphic design, but my work is basically, even though I come from an MFA background, my work is in writing and researching about design. Thanks, guys. We stayed on time.
Thank you. The first one.
Really?
Yeah. Went really smoothly. No technical issues.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. You didn't even have to do a lot in terms of getting me to stop.